We will soon be celebrating our 4th anniversary of the founding of our little church. The process of our birth has not always been easy, and the outcome has not always been certain. But we've made it, and I'm sincere in telling you that I really love who and what we have become, and I'm very happy, very satisfied to be here as your pastor. One of our speakers at the Wild Goose Festival I was attending this past week had also founded a church under circumstances fairly similar to our own, and he asked politely not to be quoted in detail about the specifics of the story of the ups and downs of their church's journey from 40 participants to over 700 members over a period of 9 years. But he said one thing that I can't help but repeat. He said, "You know, guys, you start a church with the 50 craziest kids on the playground. And that's kind of okay because most of the really crazy ones go away in the first 3 years." We also started with about 40 people, and the first couple of years included a tremendous amount of coming and going. People came in, sometimes presenting needs that were very demanding. And sometimes, even if we bent over backwards to help them in their challenging circumstances, whatever we did was not enough. And many who left angry. A few had to be asked to leave because of disruptive or dangerous behaviors. But mostly, as we were seeking to create community, we did a lot of visiting in each other's homes before we ever met for a worship service. We had dinners of the people that were interested, and we went to each other's homes, and we cooked and cleaned the houses of those who were sick. And a couple of times I had to bail people out of jail, and we got urgent medical care provided for some people that didn't have any money and didn't have any insurance. But most importantly, I think we socialized with one another. Sometimes we spent holidays together. We babysat one another's kids. Even I did when children were sick and parents needed a break. Some of us even took our family vacations together. Some of our early community members, though, had to move away for work. That always happens. Some have died. 7% of any church gathering will, within a few years, will pass away. I'm not sure what those actuarial numbers are, but the mortality rate is 100%, so there's always some losses in that regard. But there were others, some that I loved and trusted and confided in and counted to be my friends, who just disappeared. Sometimes they were offended by something that I said. I can't imagine how that could happen, but sometimes that happens. Some were unhappy with the decisions church made. We even lost people just in the decision to buy this building, that there were people that kind of liked the concept of us being camped out and not owning property, and they didn't like the transition to being a settled church. But in each of those cases where you've extended and received friendship, their departure was a blow, like a punch straight to the heart. Churches that have been around for more than a century have a core constituency that wouldn't leave if you set the building on fire. They sit in the pew where their great-grandparents sat, and their grandparents and their parents, and they have endured bad preachers and loved good ones. They've been there for the thick and for the thin. But a new church doesn't have that inherited core. We are the community who we decide that we're going to be this week. We have no heritage to lean on. Nothing holds you here other than your desire to be a part of who we are and what we do. And we've sought to create this community at a time in history when people in general, not just in the United States, but all over the world, are finding it increasingly difficult to be in community. Friendships, family members, spouses, even children have ironically become more disposable today than in any time in my memory, and I suspect that this may be a unique time in the history of the world. In 1990, I would hazard the guess that not more than one or two of us had ever even heard of Bosnians and Serbs. For our lifetimes, they were simply the people who lived in Yugoslavia. When Tito died in the early 1980s, and then internal strife led to Yugoslavia breaking up and falling apart, even many of the people who lived in Yugoslavia did not have a family memory of whether they came from Orthodox or Muslim background. And yet in a matter of months, they were killing one another. We lived the first half of our lives thinking that Muslims were Muslims. It was not until the strife in Iran and Iraq that we realized that there were Sunnis and Shia, and it took even our newspaper several years to figure out how they were going to spell that in English, that we just didn't understand the differences that locked Iraq and Iran in a war for 10 years that ended without resolution. Our own nation is possibly more divided right now than we have been since the Civil War. And I fear that if the blue states and the red states were really homogenous, if there really were conservative states and liberal states, that we would be in danger of another civil war. The advent of cell phones, the internet, Twitter, texting, the ability to Skype with almost anyone anywhere in the world at any time for free has not increased our connection to one another, but it has rather, I think, cheapened our language so that we can say that I have 1,600 friends on Facebook and no one with whom to go see a movie. That we have more connections but less connection. Because I just personally love to hear the music of Sheryl Crow and Joan Osborne and Paula Cole and Sarah McLachlan, I made the decision a few years ago to attend not one but two Lilith fairs, one in Kansas City and one in St. Louis. And I know that heterosexual males were not the target audience of the Lilith fair. And in fact, the two or three of we heterosexual males in attendance in that sea of thousands of women would sometimes have to turn and look at one another nervously and just nod. You know, I'm here, I'm not scared. Especially when the women's room got so backed up that they just evidently gave themselves permission to turn the men's room into a ladies' room. You've never really had a shy bladder until there's three women standing behind you in line for a shot at the urinal, which is something I did not want to see. I never listened to country music, but by virtue of going to the Lilith Fair, I was treated to this song by Lisa Loeb that I asked Ashley to sing for us today because the title stuck in my mind. I guess it's been, 8, 9 years since those Lilith Fairs took place? It's okay to let your phone ring here. It just costs you $1,000 to our building fund, that's all. And we kind of need some donations there. But through the years, the title of that one song has stuck with me as a succinct way of describing how incredibly shallow, how disposable our relationships often are. You remember the line, the time between meeting and finally leaving is sometimes called falling in love. I mean, it hurts to even repeat it. But it is an apt description of the way that our relationships so often go. And of course, the most obvious application of that ironic line is to personal love relationships, but it doesn't stop there. When I first became single nearly 20 years ago, I passively assumed that within a year or so I would marry again and I would try to have me some of that, what do you all call it, happily ever after. I thought it was my turn to get a little share of that. The truth of my experience is that first dates often didn't make it all the way through the appetizer before we were both aware that there would not be dessert and a lingering coffee conversation. Meaningful connection turns out to be a whole lot harder than I thought it was going to be. Oh, and I don't know, after 15, 16 years of disappointing first dates, you start to wonder if maybe I'm not quite the fetching catch that I always thought that I was. But even when you take out the alcoholics and addicts and borderline personalities and passive dependents, it still isn't easy for two adults to meet and excuse one another's idiosyncrasies enough to make a lasting relationship work. I'm not single at the age of 55 because I forgot to get married. It's because I have the dual challenge of being very picky while being nearly impossible to live with. And those two things have become quite a barrier. And I would be very worried about that fact if it were not that there were so very, very many people in about the same spot as I am. There is still over a 50% failure rate of marriages, but what doesn't really factor into that is how many people just aren't trying anymore, that there's just an awful lot of folks that are just not ever going to marry. We don't connect well in the 21st century. People are less inclined to join a small church where they actually have to interact with people that they recognize and know. A lot of the trend in church now is to go to a church that's so large that it's sort of like going to a movie theater where you temporarily gather as a random collection of strangers and scatter as soon as the popcorn is gone. Neighbors don't tend to talk to each other. People don't join civic organizations. Most families gave up trying to have family reunions before Watergate. All of our centuries of Christian worship and practice have left us with a society that is harsh and judgmental and intolerant of differences and nearly bereft of the skills, the basic social skills of forgiveness and of minding our own business enough to let other people have their own lives and be whoever they have chosen to be, and still be able to sit at the side of the pool and chat with them from time to time, even if you don't agree with their politics or approve of their personal living arrangements or care who they slept with at their home the last time. I know it was a long time ago, but I want to ask you to remember this passage of Scripture that Ashley read for us today. Isn't it amazing how the lectionary, which is written years and years ago, just give us a story about a woman who went bankrupt on doctor's fees this week after the Affordable Health Care Act was upheld. It's about a woman who has a persistent menstrual period, which, if ever there was something that was no one else's business, wouldn't that fall in that category? But in that society, when a woman was menstruating, she was considered to be somehow spiritually unclean, and she was expected to separate herself from the rest of society. Bad enough for 2 or 3 days a month, but solitary confinement for the woman in this text, who had been made to feel as if she were a leper in that community. And the use of the word leper is specifically relevant in this case, because one of the ways of looking at the healing miracles in the Gospels is to ask yourself how each of the people Jesus is said to have healed would have been cut off from community before they were healed, and how the miracle restored them to community. Lepers were forced to live away from healthy people, and when they had to walk from one place to another, they were expected to shout, "Unclean," as a warning to the healthy people that might encounter them on the road. In most cases, in our society and in theirs, we don't have to yell unclean because we've got a whole bunch of gossips who do that for us. The gossips shout and whisper about how unclean everyone else is. Mudslinging journalism tells us what everyone's failing is, everyone's illness, everyone's pain. This woman didn't walk around yelling that she was hemorrhaging, but she walked with her head bowed, face to the ground. She didn't even dare to speak to Jesus. She just reached out to touch his garments in the hope that somehow his health would rub off on her. In the church where I worked for several years, I greeted parishioners at a door that was right next to the pulpit, and the chancel was behind me. And people would line up, and they would either shake my hand or hug me, or they would go out one of the other doors. And that's the way churches tend to divide themselves. But I noticed this one tiny white-haired woman who often came through line and hugged me tight. And a few minutes later, she would be back in line again. Sometimes 2 or 3 times. She would hug me, walk up the steps to the door into the chancel, come through the chancel, and come around and get in line again. And when I asked her once why she did that, she had her answer ready. She just said, "Because you're the only one who touches me all week long. Sometimes I just need a little more contact before I go home because it's going to be a long week." And I don't want to go all Leo Buscaglia on you guys today, but do you hear how indicative that is of a society that is about to lose its civilization? For all I know, she may not have been a good mother. She may have been a crummy sister, or maybe she wasn't a good neighbor. I don't know. But whatever the reasons for her isolation were, what I'm confident of is it wasn't reason enough. When Jesus healed a leper, he restored that person to being able to go back home, to go back to work, to go to synagogue, to go to the marketplace. When he healed a blind person, a lame person, when he exorcised a demon from someone, or healed a woman with a persistent issue of blood, he broke down the barriers that kept them from being able to be in love, to have friendships, to have meaningful work again, to have family. And I don't know if you take these miracle accounts literally or metaphorically, whether they're a matter of history or just a matter of literature, but either way, they have about the same meaning, because they are all stories of restoration, of ending isolation, of opening up a way for a human being to once again become a part of a community. Many of us, if not indeed most of us, have been exiled from the community of faith that we grew up in. Some are exiles from your own family, exiled from past friendships, exiled from places of employment. When my own life blew up 5 years ago and I felt that I had been betrayed by friends and parishioners and members of my own staff, I remembered sitting in a meeting with a man who was then the chairman of the board of the church I served, and a guy I'd gone on long bike rides with, who'd been in my home, I'd been in his home. I thought we were good friends. And all I could bring myself to say to him was, I hope I never trust another human being as long as I live. It felt like the only way that I could survive. I left that church and I told my few remaining friends, Deb, you'll remember this conversation, that I was going to go to Florida, buy a coffee stand, change my name to Habib Shashimi, and I was never going to have a conversation with anyone again that went past, do you want me to leave room for cream and sugar in that? I'm only exaggerating a little bit because I really did go to Florida and I looked into businesses that were for sale. I was done with church. I was done with trying to have friends. I was done with ever trying to love or trust anyone. But I learned a couple of things pretty quickly. First is that Starbucks doesn't sell franchises. Starbucks owns all their own stores. You can't just go buy a Starbucks, so that's out. But number two is that life cut off from meaningful relationships is not worth living. It's just not. The Buddha is said to have taught, the one who has 50 loves has 50 sorrows, and the one who has 10 loves has 10 sorrows, and the one who has no loves has no sorrows. Well, I don't know who I am to disagree with Gautama Buddha, because I agree at one level that if you love anyone, you run the risk of betrayal. You run the risk of getting your heart broken. Because some people will just stop loving you for no good reason. They'll just stop. And some friends will reject you for reasons so venial it would embarrass Attila the Hun. But with all due respect to the Buddha, the person who has no loves has nothing but sorrow. That's all they've got. There is risk in loving another person, but there is certain failure in cutting yourself off from community or friendships or even the potential of love. In conclusion, then, I have this to say. Friends will sometimes reject you for no good reason. That's a fact. But I charge you not to be that person. Don't you do it. Some people will love you and include you in their lives until the day they turn their back on you. It happens. But don't you be that guy. Don't you do that to another person. In our society, when you can reach out and communicate with anyone, anywhere, at any time, it's easy to get to see any one individual as being entirely disposable because you can always replace them. But I'm here to tell you, that's not healthy. Jesus made a career of making broken people whole again, of forgiving, of healing, of restoring people to community. And if we say that we are followers of the teachings of Jesus, then we need to make it our business to forgive, to suspend judgment. It's our business to reconcile and not to reject. It's our moral obligation to work towards the creation of a peaceful, loving, healing, and reconciling community, and to reject any base impulse that we may have through moral condescension or judgment or resentment or gossip to tear a community apart. Because, folks, it's true. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. And you are all the hope that this world has in the future.
Amen.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.